The man destined to rule the city's most powerful Korean syndicate was wasting away in a palace of glass. He wasn't dying from a bullet or a blade, but from a lethal surplus of paranoia. Kong Lee, heir to a sprawling criminal empire, hadn't swallowed a real meal in over 180 days, convinced that every grain of rice was laced with the same invisible toxin that had claimed his mother. His father, Marcus Lee, watched his legacy shrivel while rival families began to circle like sharks sensing blood in the water. World-class physicians were baffled. Michelin-starred chefs were insulted. Kong had become a bulletproof ghost, haunting a high-rise fortress, rejecting the finest delicacies the city's elite had to offer. But then, a desperate, low-level guard brought him a simple, steaming container of kimchi jjigae, comfort food bought from a late-night diner and prepared by a waitress whose past was far more dangerous than the man she was about to save. The Lee penthouse wasn't a residence. It was a vault of chrome and silence. Its floor-to-ceiling windows were reinforced with 3-inch ballistic glass, offering a panoramic view of the skyline that Kong Lee barely registered. To him, the view was a mockery. He stood by the glass, his reflection staring back, gaunt, pale, with eyes that held the frantic, hunted look of a predator trapped in a cage of its own making. The fluorescent lights of the midnight Crane Diner flickered with a rhythmic, dying buzz that matched the state of Tiana Moore's life. Located on the jagged edge of the city, where the industrial district met the forgotten residential blocks, the diner was a sanctuary for the exhausted. It was a place for truckers, insomniacs, and people like Tiana, people who didn't want to be found. Tiana moved through the cramped kitchen with the muscle memory of a woman who had once commanded a 3 Michelin star line, but now she did it in a grease-stained apron. She was a ghost in her own right, hiding behind a name that wasn't hers and a history she had tried to burn. Every time the bell above the door chimed, her shoulders tightened, her eyes darting to the fogged-up windows, checking for a shadow from her past that she knew would eventually come. The diner's owner, Mr. Park, was a man of few words and even fewer questions. He let her cook the staff meals her way, and it was in those moments that the waitress vanished. Tonight, the air in the kitchen was thick with the steam of kimchi jjigae. It wasn't the refined, deconstructed version she used to plate for socialites. It was soul food. It was the smell of fermented spice, fatty pork belly, and aged broth, the kind of meal that felt like a hug from a grandmother you never had. She stood over the bubbling pot, her face damp from the heat, stirring the deep red liquid with a wooden spoon. For a few minutes, the fear that governed her life faded. She wasn't a woman on the run. She was a creator. She tasted the broth, the sharp tang of the kimchi hitting the back of her throat before the mellow warmth of the pork took over. It was perfect. It was safe. She didn't notice the man sitting at the far end of the counter, a low-level syndicate soldier named June, who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He was weary, beaten down by the tension of a penthouse that had turned into a morgue. The weight of his world was visible in the slump of his shoulders and the way his hand trembled as he reached for a glass of water. When Tiana set a bowl of the stew in front of him, originally meant for her own break, she did it with a quiet, professional grace. She didn't offer a flirtatious smile or an empty greeting. She simply placed the steaming bowl down with a pair of silver chopsticks. "On the house," she murmured, her voice low and steady. "You look like you need to remember what home tastes like." The soldier looked up, startled by the intensity of the aroma rising from the cheap plastic bowl. It wasn't just food, it was a memory. He took a spoonful, and for a moment, the grime of the city seemed to wash away. He ate with a frantic, desperate hunger, the heat of the spice bringing a flush to his sallow skin. Tiana didn't stay to watch him eat. She retreated into the shadows of the prep station, cleaning a knife with methodical precision. She didn't know that the steam rising from that bowl carried the only scent capable of piercing the lethal paranoia of the dying prince on the hill. She didn't know that by dawn, the simple act of providing a safe meal would lead the most dangerous men in the city to her door. Tiana Moore was hiding from a monster, but she was about to be summoned by a king. The black elevator glided upward in a vacuum of silence, the G-force pressing June against the reinforced steel walls. In his hand, he clutched the plastic bag from the midnight crane like it held a king's ransom. The steam from the kimchi jjigae had begun to fog the transparent lid of the container, a warm, humid contrast to the clinical, frigid air of the Lee estate. When the doors slid open to the top floor, the atmosphere was thick with the residue of a storm. A broken porcelain bowl lay in the corner, a puddle of expensive, untouched porridge staining the white marble. Marcus Lee stood by the windows, his back a rigid wall of charcoal wool, his reflection revealing a man watching his lineage vanish into a shadow. Another one, June? Marcus's voice was a low, dangerous vibration. He didn't turn around. I've had the finest chefs in the country flown in. I've had men executed for failing to tempt him. Do you really think a greasy bag from the industrial district will change the fact that my son has chosen to die? It's different, sir, June said, his voice steady despite the sweat cooling on his neck. It smells like before. Before the poisoning. Before the fear. Marcus finally turned, his eyes landing on the cheap, red-stained plastic. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he signaled toward the heavy double doors of Kang's private quarters. The suite was a tomb of glass and chrome. Kang Lee didn't look like a prince. He looked like a relic of a war that hadn't ended. He sat in a low leather chair, draped in a silk robe that seemed to swallow his protruding collarbones. His skin was the color of parched parchment, and his eyes, deep-set and burning with a frantic, crystalline intelligence, darted to the bag in June's hand. June didn't speak. He knew the rules. He set the container on the low table, peeled back the lid, and stepped back into the shadows. The scent hit the air like a physical blow. It wasn't the sterile, over-refined aroma of a five-star kitchen. It was the pungent, fermented kick of aged kimchi, the fatty richness of slow-simmered pork, and the earthy, sharp bite of scallions. It was the scent of a kitchen where a mother didn't just cook, but cared. Kang's hand, thin as a bird's wing, trembled as he reached for the plastic spoon. He stared at the broth, his reflection in the red liquid looking back at him, hollow and haunted. For 6 months, everything had smelled like copper, like chemicals, like the bitter metallic tang of betrayal. He took a small, tentative sip. The heat bloomed across his tongue, a sharp, acidic brightness that gave way to a deep, savory warmth. It was complex and unpretentious. It tasted of nothing but itself. No hidden additives, no subtle metallic aftertaste of a toxin. It tasted honest. Kang took another bite, then another, his movements growing more frantic, more primal. The bulletproof ghost was suddenly a man again, a starving animal finding a spring of fresh water in a desert. He didn't use the fine silver provided. He scraped the bottom of the plastic container with the cheap spoon, his breath coming in ragged, emotional hitches. Outside the door, Marcus Lee watched through the security monitor, his hand gripping the edge of his desk, so hard the wood groaned. He saw his son, the boy he thought he had lost to a surplus of fear, lick the red spice from his lips. Who made this? Marcus whispered, the command reaching June in the hallway. A waitress, sir. At a diner near the docks. Marcus looked back at the screen, watching Kang lean back, his eyes closing for the first time without the jagged edge of paranoia. The boy looked safe. Bring her, Marcus ordered, his voice returning to its iron-cold certainty. Bring her tonight. And tell the security team, if a single hair on her head is harmed before she reaches this penthouse, they won't live to see the sunrise. The silence following the meal was heavier than the starvation that had preceded it. Kang sat in the center of his glass and steel sanctuary, staring at the empty plastic container as if it were an alien artifact. For the first time in 6 months, the violent tremors in his hands had stilled, replaced by a terrifying clarity. His stomach, long accustomed to the corrosive burn of bile and emptiness, felt a warmth that his mind screamed was a trick. He waited for the first sign of the invisible taint. He braced for the sudden tightening of his throat, the metallic tang of cyanide, or the slow, creeping paralysis of a neurotoxin. He counted his heartbeats, 72, 75, 78. Every thud against his ribs felt like a footstep toward a cliff. His paranoia was a living thing, a shadow that had whispered of his mother's agonizing end every time he looked at a plate of food. It didn't believe in safety. It only believed in delayed consequences. Outside the reinforced double doors, the atmosphere in the penthouse was one of breathless, mounting shock. The security feed was being broadcast to a secondary monitor in the war room, where the syndicate's top lieutenants stood like statues. They had seen Kong reject offerings from world-renowned culinary masters. They had seen him watch, cold and unmoved, as bodyguards collapsed from the very pre-tasted meals they had served him. He finished it, Marcus Lee whispered, his voice a rasp of disbelief. The hunger war had been the syndicate's greatest vulnerability. A weak heir was a beacon for the rival families, an invitation for a coup. To see Kong, the skeletal, haunted ghost of their future, scrape a cheap plastic bowl clean was a shift in the tectonic plates of their world. Inside the room, Kong stood up. His legs felt like glass, but they held. He walked to the low table, his eyes fixed on the residual red oil at the bottom of the container. He inhaled deeply. It still smelled of fermented spice and honesty. There was no chemical sharpness, no bitter undertone of betrayal. "June," Kong croaked, his voice cracking from months of disuse. The door opened instantly. June stood there, eyes wide, looking at the empty bowl and then at the man who was finally standing upright. "Who?" Kong asked, his gaze piercing. "Not which restaurant. Which hands?" "A waitress, sir," June replied, bowing low. "She cooked the staff meal herself. She didn't know it was for you. She didn't even know who I was." Kang's jaw tightened. The logic of his paranoia struggled to find a foothold. If she didn't know him, she couldn't hate him. If she didn't hate him, she had no reason to kill him. It was a fragile, dangerous thread of trust, but it was the only one he had. He looked at the security camera, knowing his father was watching. He knew the machinery of the Lee family was already in motion. The black SUVs were likely already warming up, the tactical teams checking their sidearms. They would bring her here like a captured bird, and they would ruin the very thing that made her food taste like life, her freedom. "Bring her," Kong commanded, his eyes flashing with a sudden, predatory spark that hadn't been seen since the funeral. "But June, if your men put a hand on her, if they treat her like a prisoner before she reaches this floor, I will ensure they never eat again." He sat back down, the ghost of the spice still lingering on his lips. The war wasn't over. The hunger was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind, but for the first time in 187 days, the enemy was no longer the plate in front of him. It was the world that had forced him to be afraid of it. He closed his eyes, and, for a fleeting second, he didn't see the poison. He saw the steam from a late-night diner, and a woman whose hands held the only weapon that could truly save him. The shift began with a shadow across the diner's fogged window, followed by the heavy, synchronized thrum of idling engines that silenced the local crickets. When the bell above the door chimed, it wasn't the tentative ring of a late-shift trucker. It was the sharp, metallic herald of men who owned the pavement they walked on. June entered first, looking cleaner than he had hours ago, followed by two men in suits so sharp they seemed to cut the dim light of the midnight crane. Tiana didn't scream. She didn't even drop the rag she was using to wipe the counter. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that screamed, "He found me." But as her eyes scanned the men, she realized these weren't her ex-boyfriend's thugs. These were higher up the food chain, predators of a different genus. "Tiana Moore," June said, his voice holding a strange note of reverence. "You need to come with us." "I have a shift to finish," she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the ice flooding her veins. "The shift is over," June countered, placing a stack of $100 bills on the counter, more than the diner made in a month. "Mr. Lee is waiting." The ride in the black SUV was a study in claustrophobic luxury. The interior smelled of expensive leather and cold air conditioning, a world away from the scent of frying onions and floor wax. Tiana sat between the two silent sentries, watching the industrial outskirts bleed into the glittering, vertical dominance of the city's heart. She looked at her hands, still red from the dishwater, and felt the familiar, sickening pull of the golden cage. She had spent her life trying to escape the control of powerful men, only to be swallowed by the largest shadow of them all. The fortress was a monolith of glass and obsidian. They bypassed the lobby, whisking her through a private elevator that ascended with a stomach-turning speed. When the doors opened, she was met with the sterile, intimidating grandeur of the Lee penthouse. Marcus Lee was waiting for her in a room that felt like the bridge of a battleship. He stood silhouetted against the city lights, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't look like a mobster. He looked like a king who had just averted a coup. He turned, his gaze raking over Tiana's grease-stained apron and tired eyes with the clinical intensity of a man appraising a rare diamond found in a coal mine. "You cooked the stew," Marcus stated. It wasn't a question. "I did," Tiana said, refusing to bow her head. Marcus stepped closer, the weight of his presence enough to make the air feel thick. "My son has not eaten in 6 months. He has rejected the finest palates in the world. He believes the world is a poison, Tiana Moore. But tonight, he ate your food. Every drop." He walked to a heavy mahogany desk and flicked open a leather folder. Inside was a contract and a cashier's check that made Tiana's breath hitch. The zeros seemed to stretch into infinity. $50,000 a month, Marcus said, his voice an iron-cold rasp. "You will live here. You will cook every meal he touches. You will have access to any ingredient, any tool, any luxury you desire. In return, you disappear. No phone, no friends, no life outside these walls. You become his life support." Tiana looked at the check, then at the sprawling, lonely city beyond the glass. She thought of the monsters in her past who were still hunting her, the shadow of Derek and the debts that weren't hers. Here, behind 3 inches of ballistic glass and a small army of soldiers, she would be a prisoner, but she would be a safe one. "And if I say no?" she asked quietly. Marcus offered a small, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're a smart woman, Tiana. You know that in this city, some invitations are merely commands wrapped in velvet. My son is alive tonight because of you. I do not intend to let that miracle walk out the door." He pushed the pen toward her. The golden cage was open, glowing with the promise of wealth and the silence of a tomb. Tiana reached out, her fingers trembling as she picked up the pen, realizing she wasn't just signing a contract. She was signing over her soul to a man she had never met, all for the sake of a ghost who found safety in her kitchen. The heavy mahogany door to Marcus Lee's study groaned as it swung open, but it wasn't a guard who entered. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, the temperature plunging into a clinical, sharp chill. Kong Lee stood in the threshold. He was a specter draped in dark silk, his frame so skeletal it was a miracle the fabric didn't simply slide off his shoulders. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, his knuckles white as he gripped the wood for support, but his eyes were alive. They weren't the dull, fading embers Marcus had seen for months. They were twin blades of cold obsidian, fixed entirely on Tiana. Tiana felt a shiver of pure, instinctual recognition. This was the man who had eaten her soup. Up close, his pallor was even more alarming. His skin stretched so thin over his cheekbones it looked like wet paper. Yet, despite the frailty, there was an unmistakable aura of command, a predatory shadow that hadn't quite been erased by the hunger. "Leave the check, father." Kang's voice was a rasp, a sound like dry leaves skittering over pavement. It was the first time Tiana had heard him speak, and the raw authority in it made the 2 guards in the room stiffen. Marcus frowned, his hand still hovering near the contract. "She is an employee, Kong. There are protocols for live-in staff. Security sweeps, background deep dives, a 24-hour detail." "No." Kong cut him off, the word sharp enough to draw blood. He moved slowly into the room, every step a calculated battle against his own weakness. He stopped inches from Tiana. She could smell the faint, lingering scent of the ginger and garlic from her stew on his breath, mixed with the sterile scent of hospital-grade air. He looked down at her hands, the hands that had cooked for him. Then, he turned his gaze to his father. "She is not a prisoner," Kong said, his voice gaining a terrifying, low-register strength. If she is searched like a criminal, if she is shadowed like a target, the food will taste of fear. And I am done eating fear. Kong, be reasonable, Marcus began, his voice rising in warning. We don't know who she is. She could be a plant from the Park Syndicate, a sleeper cell. She is the woman who just saved my life while your loyal chefs failed for 18 weeks, Kong countered. He turned back to Tiana, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. You will live in the East Wing. You will have your own key. No guards inside your quarters. No cameras in your kitchen. My father's men will stay on the other side of the glass. Tiana exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Marcus, who was simmering with a quiet, dangerous rage, and then back at the dying prince who had just granted her the only thing she valued more than the money, a shred of dignity. I won't be a bird in a cage, Tiana whispered, her voice finding its courage. You'll be my chef, Kong corrected, a ghost of a smile, dark and fleeting, touching his cracked lips. And as long as you feed me, no one in this house, including the man who built it, will touch a hair on your head. That is my condition, or I stop eating again tonight. The ultimatum hung in the air, a daring gamble. Marcus Lee looked at his son, then at the woman who had become his son's only tether to the world of the living. With a sharp, dissatisfied jerk of his head, Marcus signaled the guards to step back. Fine, Marcus hissed, flicking the pen toward Tiana. Sign. But if he so much as coughs wrong, Tiana Moore, there isn't a shadow in this city deep enough to hide you. Tiana didn't look at the check. She looked at Kong. For a split second, the paranoia in his eyes vanished, replaced by a strange, flickering spark of gratitude. She picked up the pen and signed. She was still in a fortress, but as Kang's hand briefly steadied hers on the desk, his skin cold as ice, she realized she wasn't just a prisoner anymore. She was an ally in a war where the only weapon was the truth of a shared meal. The transition from the grease-slicked kitchen of the Midnight Crane to the professional-grade laboratory of the Lee estate was jarring. Here, the air was filtered, the surfaces were surgical-grade stainless steel, and the silence was heavy enough to feel like a weight. Tiana moved through the space with the quiet efficiency of a woman reclaiming her true skin. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was creating. The preparation of the evening meal was a slow, meditative ritual. Tiana focused on the ingredients, her fingers finding solace in the familiar textures. She sliced the mu, the heavy Korean radish, into translucent moons, the knife clicking rhythmically against the board. She soaked dried anchovies and kelp for the base broth, the water turning a deep, earthy amber. There was no conversation, only the hum of the high-end refrigerator and the hiss of the blue flame beneath a heavy stone pot. She felt the weight of the cameras, though she never looked at them. She knew that somewhere in the darkened suite of the East Wing, Kong Lee was watching. In his room, draped in shadows and hooked to a silent pulse oximeter, Kong stared at the high-definition monitor. He didn't watch her with the lust of a man or the suspicion of a mobster. He watched her with the frantic, religious intensity of a believer looking for a miracle. He watched the way she bruised the garlic with the flat of her blade, the way she tasted the broth and adjusted the seasoning with a tiny pinch of sea salt, her eyes closing in concentration. He watched her hands. They were scarred, reddened by years of service, but they moved with a grace that suggested they were incapable of malice. In his mind, those hands were the only things in the world that weren't stained with the blood of his family's business. To Kong, the kitchen had become a sanctuary of honesty in a house built on lies. He found himself mesmerized by the steam rising from the pot, imagining the scent of the galbatang, the clear beef, short-rib soup, piercing through the clinical scent of his isolation. Tiana worked with a singular focus, to nourish the ghost. She chose ingredients that were gentle on a stomach that had forgotten how to process life. Tender ribs that had been simmered until the meat surrendered from the bone, dates for a subtle sweetness, and softened glass noodles. She plated the meal not on sterling silver, but in a simple, heavy ceramic bowl that held the heat. When she finished, she placed the tray on the sliding service hatch that separated the kitchen from his private corridor. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers lingering on the edge of the tray. She knew he was looking at her right then. She didn't offer a smile. That would have been a lie, but she bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect toward the man who had chosen to trust her when he trusted nothing else. As she retreated, Kong watched her exit the frame on his monitor. Only then did he move toward the hatch. The scent of the soup reached him before he even touched the bowl, rich, clean, and carrying the unmistakable depth of 1,000 years of heritage. He sat at his small table, the blue light of the security feed still glowing in the background, and took his first sip. For the first time in 6 months, the knot of terror in his chest loosened. He wasn't just eating. He was being healed by a woman who remained a shadow, even as she brought him back into the light. The silence of the East Wing was no longer a void. It became a bridge. As the days bled into weeks, the service hatch transformed from a clinical exchange point into a lifeline. It began on a Tuesday, when Tiana retrieved the empty ceramic bowl of dakjuk, of velvety rice and chicken porridge, and found a small, jagged scrap of paper tucked beneath the spoon. The handwriting was shaky, the ink bleeding slightly into the grain of the napkin. It was a single sentence in Korean, followed by a rough English translation. The ginger was a memory I thought I had buried. Tiana stood in the middle of her gleaming kitchen, the note trembling in her hand. For the first time, the ghost on the other side of the wall was no longer just a set of stats on a security monitor or a skeletal figure in a silk robe. He was a man with a palate, a history, and a soul that was slowly being resuscitated by the heat of her stove. The next morning, she sent back more than just a bowl of mayakguk. Tucked beside a small dish of seasoned sprouts was her own note, written on a clean slip of parchment. Ginger is for the heart. It warms what the world tries to freeze. The exchange became their secret ritual, a dialogue of ink and steam that bypassed the prying eyes of Marcus Lee's surveillance. As the physical distance between them remained absolute, the emotional distance evaporated. The ribs were tender, he wrote a few days later, the handwriting noticeably firmer, the lines straighter. I haven't felt my own strength in years. My father thinks it's a miracle. I think it's just the salt. Tiana replied as she deboned a fish for the evening's broth. It isn't the salt, Kong. It's the trust. Food is only poison if you don't know who prepared the hearth. Through these scraps of paper, the bulletproof ghost began to take shape. He told her about the gardens in Jeju where his mother used to take him, and how the smell of toasted sesame oil always preceded her laughter. He spoke of the suffocating weight of the Lee name, a crown made of lead that had nearly crushed the life out of him before she arrived. In return, Tiana shared fragments of her own truth, careful to keep the darkest parts of her history veiled. She wrote of the grandmother who taught her that a recipe was a prayer, and the joy of seeing someone truly seen through a meal. She didn't tell him about Derek or the blood on her old apron, but she told him that she, too, knew what it was like to live in a cage, even if hers had once been made of Michelin stars and accolades. On the 21st day, the tray came back with something different. Beside the empty bowl was a small, dried wildflower, likely plucked from one of the decorative vases in the hallway, and a note that made Tiana's heart skip a beat. I looked at my reflection today. The note read, "The animal in the snare is gone. My father wants me to attend a board meeting tomorrow. He says the king has returned. But I know the king didn't return. He was fed back into existence by a woman who doesn't even know the color of his eyes." Tiana touched the dried petals, the scent of the kitchen, garlic, toasted grain, and hope swirling around her. She realized then that she was no longer just cooking for a shadow. She was nurturing a predator who was regaining his teeth, and for the first time, the thought didn't terrify her. She picked up her pen, her eyes fixed on the security camera. She knew he was watching. "I know the color of your eyes, Kong," she wrote. "They are the color of a man who is finally hungry for more than just survival." She pushed the tray through the hatch, the metal sliding with a soft, decisive click. On the other side, she heard a sharp intake of breath. The hunger war was being won, one note and one plate at a time, but as Kang's strength returned, so did the reality of the world they occupied, a world where every bridge was a target, and every secret was a debt waiting to be collected. The sanctuary of the East Wing had begun to feel like a home, but the world outside the ballistic glass was a machine that never stopped grinding. Tiana had accumulated nearly $70,000 in a locked drawer, a fortune that was supposed to be her ticket to a new life. Yet the walls of the fortress felt thinner with every passing day. The security protocols had loosened slightly as Kang's health returned. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man who walked the halls with a silent, predatory grace, his presence enough to make the guards straighten their ties. Because of this new stability, Tiana was occasionally permitted to leave the grounds under heavy escort to source rare ingredients that the syndicate's usual suppliers couldn't provide. It happened on a humid Thursday evening. Tiana was stepping out of a black sedan near a specialty market, June standing a few paces behind her, distracted by an urgent buzz on his radio. The street was a narrow vein of the city, crowded with the late-night rush. From the mouth of a darkened alley, a voice she had spent 2 years trying to forget cut through the noise like a serrated blade. "Well, look at you, Tiana. Or should I call you Chef again?" Tiana froze, the bag of dried peppers slipping from her fingers. Derek stepped into the light, his cheap suit smelling of stale cigarettes and desperation. His eyes were bloodshot, lit with a frantic, greedy fire that told her he had been watching her for a long time. He had followed the black cars. He had seen the way the most dangerous men in the city treated her like porcelain. "Derek," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "Go away. You have no idea what kind of people you're dealing with." "Oh, I think I do," he sneered, stepping closer, his hand darting out to grip her upper arm. His fingers dug into her skin, a familiar, bruising pressure. "You found yourself a very shiny cage, haven't you? Living in the Lee Fortress, cooking for the little prince." I did a bit of digging. The syndicate is desperate to keep him healthy, which means you're very, very valuable. "Let go of me," she hissed, her eyes darting toward June, whose back was still turned as he navigated a security dispute on his headset. "Not until we settle the bill," Derek growled, pulling her closer until his breath was hot against her ear. 50,000, Tiana. That's the price for my silence. If I don't get it by tomorrow night, I go to the Park family. I tell them exactly who is keeping the Lee heir alive. I tell them how to get to the kitchen. I'll turn your little miracle into a massacre." The blood drained from Tiana's face. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the single point of failure for an empire. If Derek talked to the rivals, the safe, food she prepared would become a target. Every meal would become a gamble again, and Kang's hard-won trust would shatter. "I don't have that kind of money," she lied, her mind racing toward the drawer in her room. "Liar. I see the cars. I see the jewels you aren't wearing," Derek hissed, his face contorting. He raised his hand, the old, violent impulse flaring in his eyes as he prepared to strike her for defying him. "You're going to get me that money, or I'll make sure the last thing you ever cook is." "Is what exactly?" The voice didn't come from June. It came from the shadow of the sedan. Kong Lee stood there, his long coat swirling around his ankles like a dark cloud. He looked nothing like the skeletal boy who had once hidden in a silk robe. He stood tall, his shoulders broad, his face carved from cold stone. He didn't look angry. He looked bored, the way a lion looks at a fly before snapping its jaws. Derek's grip on Tiana's arm slackened, his bravado evaporating as he looked into the eyes of a man who had stared at death for 6 months and decided he wasn't interested. "Kong," Tiana gasped, stepping back. Kong didn't look at her yet. His gaze remained fixed on Derek, a chilling, predatory focus that made the air in the alley feel like it was being vacuum-sealed. "You're hurting my chef," Kong said, his voice a low, melodic threat. "And in this city, that is an offense punishable by a silence much longer than the one you're offering." As June finally spun around, realizing his lapse, Kong raised a single hand to stop him. He stepped forward, the streetlights catching the sharp edge of his jaw. The ghost had returned, and he had brought the full weight of the Lee Syndicate with him. The air in the alleyway turned brittle, the humidity of the city night suddenly feeling like the static before a lightning strike. Derek's hand, which had been raised to strike Tiana, hung suspended in the air. He looked at Kong Lee, and the greed in his eyes was instantly replaced by the primal realization that he was no longer the apex predator in the conversation. Kong stepped closer, his movements devoid of the hesitation that had defined his months of illness. He moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, his dark eyes reflecting the neon glow of the street like a deep, sunless sea. He stopped just inches from Derek, his physical presence so overwhelming that Tiana felt the need to take a step back. "You speak of debt," Kong said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. "But you have no understanding of the balance sheet you are looking at. This woman did not just trade up. She performed a miracle. She brought back a king from the edge of a grave your kind couldn't even imagine." Derek tried to find his voice, his chest puffing out in a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim his bravado. "Listen, you don't know who she is. I'm a cop. Well, I was. I have friends. I have information that could." The sound of Kang's laughter was short, dry, and entirely devoid of humor. It was the sound of bone grinding against bone. "You have nothing but a mouth that talks too much and a hand that was foolish enough to touch what is mine." Before Derek could blink, Kang's hand shot out. It wasn't the weak, trembling limb Tiana had seen in the kitchen. It was a vise of iron. He gripped Derek's wrist, the one still hovering near Tiana's face, and twisted. The sickening crack of bone echoed off the brick walls, followed by Derek's strangled scream. "June," Kong said, not looking away from Derek's contorting face. "Sir," June replied, stepping out of the shadows with a suppressed pistol already drawn. The bodyguard's face was a mask of professional shame. He would deal with his own failure later, but for now, he was a tool of his master's will. "This man believes $50,000 is the price of his silence," Kong murmured, his gaze dropping to the floor where the spilled peppers lay. "He believes he can threaten the source of my life and walk away to spend the coin. Correct his misunderstanding. Ensure that he is never capable of speaking her name again, in any language, to any family." "No, wait." Derek gasped, his face slick with sweat as he collapsed to his knees, his broken wrist cradled against his chest. "I'll go. I'll disappear. Tiana, tell him." Tiana looked at the man who had tormented her, who had turned her life into a series of shadowed corners and frantic exits. She saw the cowardice beneath the cruelty, and then she looked at Kong. The heir to the Lee Syndicate wasn't looking at Derek with hatred. He was looking at him like a nuisance that needed to be scrubbed away to keep the kitchen clean. "You told me once that food is only poison if you don't know who prepared the hearth," Kong said, finally turning his eyes to Tiana. The coldness didn't vanish, but it softened into something protective, something fiercely possessive. "I know who prepared mine, and I do not allow anyone to threaten the hearth." He reached out, his fingers grazing Tiana's cheek, catching a stray tear she hadn't realized had fallen. His touch was cold, but it felt like the only solid thing in a world that had been shaking for years. "Go to the car, Tiana," he commanded gently. "The smell of this alley is beginning to ruin the memory of tonight's dinner." Tiana hesitated for only a heartbeat before she turned and walked toward the idling sedan. Behind her, she heard the muffled scuffle of June dragging Derek further into the darkness of the industrial block, and the heavy, final thud of a car door closing. When Kong entered the back seat moments later, he didn't look like a man who had just ordered a soul to be erased. He looked like a man who had finally found his appetite. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, folded scrap of parchment, their ritual. He didn't write anything this time. He simply handed her back her own note from a week ago, the one that said, "I know the color of your eyes." Beneath her words, in a bold, unwavering hand, he had added a final line. "And now you know the length of my shadow. You are safe, Tiana. Cook for me again tomorrow." As the Maybach pulled away from the curb, leaving the ghosts of the past in the rearview mirror, Tiana realized the cage was still made of gold, and it was still locked. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't looking for the exit. She was looking at the man beside her, the predator who had become her protector, and she realized that some prisons were the only places where a woman could finally breathe.